Welcome to the East-West webinar on manufacturing plant changes in China. This is Alex Bryant. Appreciate you all attending. We've got a fair amount of people signed up for the webinar tonight, those here in the U.S. and those in China. I want to make a quick housekeeping note. We've got, for those who are attending, we've got, there's a box on your right-hand side that allows you to ask questions. Please feel free to ask any questions you want. I will then ask the specialists on the phone for their answers on the questions. Please feel free to ask any questions and just using the question box. Okay, we'll first get started. Let me just briefly explain who East West is. We're a firm based Shanghai and in the U.S. Our focus is the operational, commercial, risk management solutions for companies competing on the ground in China. The team we have are our Westerners and Chinese who've all spent their careers running and having P&L responsibilities for running Western multinationals in China, both U.S. and European companies. We founded in 2005, and we provide a brief background on our experience in different industry sectors. This slide briefly describes our 10 core services, but again, they fall into the operational, commercial, and risk management services. So we are not the lawyers, we're not the accountants, we're the individuals who've all run companies on the ground in China profitably, but within the confines of U.S. law and Chinese law, when we ran these U.S. companies and European companies on the ground in China. I want to introduce the speakers briefly on the phone. Myself as Alex Bryant, the founder and president of East West. Jay Honig and Warren Wisniewski could not join us. He had a family emergency. So Dan McLeod, who is based in Nantong right now, is currently building a chemical facility in Nantong. Dan will be replacing Warren Wisniewski. Jay, if you'd give a brief background on yourself, please.
Yeah, my name's Jay Honig. I've got 40 plus years in the consulting business, half of that in the US and Europe, and the other half in Asia Pacific. I was the general manager of Bechtel Group. I was general manager of the Asia Pacific region based in Shanghai. I also spent a considerable amount of time in AmJam. I was both the vice chairman and the chairman of AmJam back in 2002 and 2003.
Jay, thank you very much. Dan McLeod, if you would provide your background.
Yes, hello. I spent my career in manufacturing, both operations and capital project management and engineering. Most of that has been in the chemical industry, although I've got some experience in food and electrical components industry as well. The last 20 years I've been working in Asia. The majority of that time has been in China, although I've also worked in Singapore, Indonesia, Taiwan, Korea, and the Philippines. And again, that's all been in a manufacturing environment and major capital project management.
Great, Dan, thank you very much. So Dan and Jay, just like the rest of the team of Chinese and Westerners we have that have all run and have been our responsibilities for running companies on the ground in China and Asia Pacific. Okay, getting to the actual topic, we are going to have covering three things today. The presentation will be broken down into three parts. We're going to spend a brief period of time, about 15 minutes, briefly overseeing the changing business landscape in China, specifically as results to location strategy and site selection on the strategic side, and then also on the implementation side, implementing plant closures, plant relocations on the ground in China. We'll review the drivers of change, but we're going to spend most of our time on the last bullet point, which is two current case studies of clients we've worked on. One was a site selection for a chemical company, a German firm, German chemical client, manufacturing firm, and then secondly on a U.S. Manufacturing firm that had to be relocated. The case studies, Jay will take one, Dan will take the other. So just to cover the brief presentation up front on the changing landscape, Jay, I'm going to turn that over to you and let you take it from there.
Okay, thank you. I know many of you are based in China, so a lot of this is going to be old news. Uh, when you talk about changing business environment, I think that goes with China and the entire China business environment. It's changing every year. The market seems to take one turn or another, but I think there's some things that we've seen recently that are adding some additional challenges to the operating environment. First of all, I think most companies that are in China are profitable, have been for a long time, yet margins are dropping. If you ask, are those companies going to continue to expand in China? Some 61% say yes, they will continue to expand and feel that China is one of their core markets globally. So a lot of attention is being given to China. Obviously, it's a maturing market, and there are still continuing challenges. We're seeing certainly labor costs across the country increasing, basically mandated, if you will, nationwide. So you're seeing increased labor. You're seeing pro-labor laws that are protecting the exploitation of labor. And you still have continuing corporate governance and business ethics issues relative to things, corruption and IP theft and situations such as that. Next slide. Since we're focusing basically on relocation and site selection, some of these statistics are nationwide and by Chinese sources. So you can see that there's a significant increase in new facility openings, new construction, as well as plant locations. And as a result of some relocations, you're seeing closures as well. So it's an important topic right now. One of the issues that I think we're hearing more and more commonly is pollution, air pollution, and air and water and wastewater pollution. It is a driver in many cases for companies having to relocate, but it's not the only one. So as we look strategically at site location, and then how do we implement our decision, you're going to see that combating industrial pollution and the environmental topics seem to take a very strong position relative to siting a new plant. Next slide. So we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at really site selection from an overview standpoint, and we're going to look at closures from an overview viewpoint. So if we look at site selection, we've tried to summarize it into really four categories. Again, number one is combating industrial pollution. That's forcing companies to relocate. Obviously, the Go West initiatives that started some 15 years ago is really starting to gain traction, and the second and third tier cities out west are providing for a much larger customer base. Along with that, you're seeing urban renewal, that in many cases companies that came here in the late 90s, early 2000s built a factory in what was then sort of the outskirts of a major first tier city, now is being overrun by urban development and renewal and housing and so forth. And then there is obviously a program with respect to the government encouraging companies to move into industry-specific industrial parks. Next slide. If you can look at just some of these basic statistics, there's a tremendous amount of activity closing down polluting factories that are near waterways, that are near lakes and streams and what have you. And that's really addressing or focused on chemical refining, textiles, tanning, and those types of industries. So you're seeing an awful lot of that going on. It just shows you some of the statistics associated with that. Next slide.
Sure. Moving on now.
Environmental program, again, accelerating. We're seeing that more and more companies are being encouraged, if not forced, to move into industrial parks that specialize in their particular industry, which allows them to have the water and wastewater infrastructure that avoids polluting local farmland and adjacent properties and so forth. Next slide. Population infrastructure. Certainly anybody in China who understands China understands the rapidly changing demographics of the population. They're moving to the cities. The Go West issues is providing significant opportunities out west for employment, yet that's negatively impacting labor markets in the Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta. So not only from an age demographic, but from a geographic demographics, you're going to see the coastal area is going to be struggling for labor, which means labor costs will probably rise. So again, you're seeing significant amount of issues that are changing the dynamics of the workforce and creating greater opportunities for consumers out west. Infrastructure has been really a major pillar of the GDP for China. U.S. it's consumer driven. In China, it's infrastructure driven, i.e. government investment. And that investment is going to continue to go for some time. So that's going to open up the country and again, provide greater access to local markets throughout China. So as companies are looking to relocate, where they used to have a major beachhead, if you will, in Shenzhen and Guangzhou and Beijing, Shanghai area. Now companies are wanting to capitalize on the second and third tier cities moving westward. Next slide. Free trade zones. We've talked a little bit about that already. You're seeing an increase in those zones and business parks that are going to specialize in certain industries. This is directed at the state level, and they see really two areas of two goals here. One is to allow companies to specialize and become world class in their specific industries, and also minimize the sort of rogue local village mixed use development zones that don't have as much control over operations and environmental issues. Next slide. So looking at that sort of the macro level of in China, dealing with strategic issues relative to site selection. When we talk about closures, closures have been ongoing for some time, and I think the initial ramp up really started in 2008, 9. Up until that point, it was expand, expand, expand. The market's growing, profits are good. But for the first time, both domestic and foreign companies hit a brick wall with respect to the financial downturn. At that point in time, you had tens of millions of migrant workers and laid off in a period of 3, 4, 5, 6 months. That created a significant issue. One of the when you're looking at a closure, some things you need to keep in mind. Number one, that closures within zones and in industrial areas in general are pretty well known. They know labor knows what severance packages should be and what's prevailing in the particular area. They know that there are new pro-labor regulations that really require certain types of severance pay for different situations. You still have some issues relative to retroactive compliance issues around housing and so forth. And if you've been here for a while, you've been in China with a factory for 15 years, you may have some special arrangements with labor to pay cash as opposed to certain compliance issues, and you need to be careful that you know what sort of retroactive compliance issues you are meeting or you're not meeting. Threats. Go back to slide. Instances of militancy and threats and sit-ins and strikes and stalking, kidnapping. We've seen an awful lot of this over the last, say, 10 years. It's generally rather intense. If it's going to happen, it's going to be intense. It'll last for a short period of time until calmer heads prevail and you're able to negotiate the conditions of severance. Looking forward, you obviously have issues relative to permitting of a new facility. And again, you're going to see increased scrutiny on your environmental issues, and you'll probably not get the same level of business incentives that you did 10 years ago. Next slide. So again, these are statistics. We've seen it. We've seen the strikes. We've seen the threats. We've seen sabotage of product and so forth and so on. This is not unusual, but I think you need to be aware that if you are going to close a plant, you need to be able to address these issues. Next slide. Again, as you look forward towards a new location, if you're out of the into a different district, certain municipality or certainly province, you're going to have to re-register all your new licenses, all your applicable documentation. And as a result, if you're going to construct a new plant, we've seen a slowdown, if you will, and even a backlog of permit applications for construction of new facilities. Next slide. So all in all, and this is really a snapshot of a closure and looking for a new location, but as a company, we always advise that you form a task force of different skill sets, whether it's HR, labor, HR, legal, operations, security, and so forth, and make sure that you have a real understanding of who you're going to impact with a relocation. And that relocation doesn't necessarily just impact current employees. It may impact second and third tier suppliers that may react to your closing of a facility. And then that you put together a structured plan and then follow that plan through the overall implementation period. So with that, let me, that's been somewhat of a snapshot. We're going to look at two case studies. Dan's going to do the first one, which is again on a major site selection, and then I'll do one on a closure and construction of a new facility. I'll turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Jay. Yes, recently worked on a project with a client, a fine chemical company with sales globally. They're well established. They've been well established in China, operating a manufacturing site in South China, in Guangdong, dating to the 90s, and they've been successful and grown. They've established a network of satellite distribution warehouses around China to support customers in East China, the Greater Shanghai, Jiangsu region, and in the north, Qingdao, Beijing, that region. East West started working with them on first an overall assessment of their operation. They're looking at the future state of the company, primarily because there were a couple of different reasons. They were receiving increased scrutiny from regulators at their site in Guangdong. The facility they were operating had been, again, in place for over 20 years and was built in a older mixed-use industrial park that really didn't have the infrastructure in place to support a chemical operation. And secondly, over time, they've seen major shifts in their customer base. Early on, a sizable percentage of their customers were located in the south in Guangdong, and that had changed over the years. East China, the Shanghai, Jiangsu, Zhejiang region is really the primary industrial driver for the process industries, and much of their client base had moved, relocated, or invested in that area. So we helped them to identify a new operating model and provided project management to find it and develop that site. Next slide, please.
Okay, and Dan, if you can, I know you're calling in from China and the speaker having issues on the speaker. If you can speak more clearly, into it, it'd be helpful, I think.
Okay. Looking at their future state, a couple of things to highlight. We did want to emphasize with them that the importance of being in a chemical-specific zone for their operations. As I mentioned earlier, in these zones, the infrastructure is in place. Environmental wastewater, for example, is in place. The zone management tends to be focused in a few specific industries and understands those industries and can be more supportive. And the other thing we had seen and have been seeing is those zones are filling up, particularly in the more desirable areas in East China. And so we encourage them to move reasonably quickly to identify a new location and work with them to find an appropriate site. I mentioned earlier that their client base had moved, and if you looked at the breakdown that's shown on the slide, 2/3 of their clients were in the east, and they were operating out of the south. So this created some supply chain challenges for them. It added transit time to supply their customers. It added costs for warehousing in that area, and to a large extent, their raw materials were also coming from that part of the country. So they were, from a logistics and inventory standpoint, they were getting hit both on incoming materials and finished product. Next slide, please. So after analysis, we looked at, again, distribution costs, and we came to the conclusion that they should be in Eastern China, closer to their customers, also close to their suppliers, and projected savings on transportation and warehousing that were significant annually, and also inventory reduction on raw materials and finished goods. We saw a significant opportunity for that by locating closer to their customers and their suppliers.
Hey, Dan, we had a question come in asking about chemicals, in particular, and other industry sectors that are affected by the environmental compliance coming out of Beijing. Question was, how has the site selection changed for chemical companies and other industries who are trying to identify the right sites in business parks when they're addressing, in light of the new in light of the continued compliance efforts made by the Chinese government?
I think the most shortest and succinct answer to that is to find industry-specific zones. The chemical industry is one example, but there's also zones that are focused on pharma and food that they also have certain challenges, regulatory challenges. We recommend going with national level zones that are well established and you would expect to continue to be well established. Where companies have gotten into problems in the past is going into locally established zones that really aren't positioned to be in place for the long term. So if you look at the national level zones, they've got a much higher likelihood of being there for the long term. So that's the easiest way to go. And at the same time, with those zones, industry specific, the support you'll get from the zone in terms of permitting and regulatory support are very helpful as well, and allow you to streamline your permit application process and getting your approvals.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next slide, please. Part of our site assessment work, we identified two locations with high potential. One relatively close to Shanghai, Eastern China, on the Yangtze River Delta, and then one further west, several hours driving time west of Shanghai. And a comparison of some of the major operating costs developed. And you see, as you go further west, labor costs are lower as you'd expect, but because of the distribution of the customer base, we expect logistics costs to be higher and to more than offset the savings in labor costs. We're able to get some favorable pricing on land and land incentives closer to Shanghai, so that was a real plus also for this project. Next slide, please.
Dan, a question popped up. In this case, this company you're describing had to move a lot because of urbanization, urban renewal in that area. Question was, is the government generally compensating companies who haven't moved for urbanization?
Yes, that's what we've seen. I'm not aware of any specific formulas that are being used. My experience has been it's been an individual negotiation, and there is compensation available. It's usually not enough to fully offset the cost of relocation, but it's certainly helpful. And it's again, it's a point of negotiation. It's something that expect to spend quite a bit of effort on if you're faced with that.
Okay.
Okay. As I mentioned, we are focused on locations in the Yangtze River Delta region, primarily to be closer to the customer and supplier base, focused on national level chemical industry parks, which is becoming more challenging in this part of the country as those zones are filling up, and it's been very well established in the last 15 to 20 years. We searched for available investment incentives, and those are still available, and we were able to secure some pretty attractive incentives. We'll talk about that in a bit, but they are available, and they vary from zone to zone, and situation to situation. It's very much what you can negotiate. We did look further west, Anhui province, which is province west of Jiangsu, and again the advantages are lower labor costs. Disadvantages are primarily logistics. So if you're in this case, the client's product is got a rather large water component to it, so transportation can be relatively expensive, and so that was a major driver that really directed us to look further east. Next slide, please.
Sure. And Dan, question came up. What was the overall investment in this? What's the projected investment for this kind of project?
This is a relatively modest project. It's about a $20 million investment.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. We identified and interviewed more than 20 chemical parks around eastern China, and made sure that sites they were suitable for the chemical industry, certainly, and for the type of chemistry that this client wanted to do. We were able to obtain incentives through negotiation, and all of the zones generally will provide utility and local labor costs. That's available for comparison. I would encourage you to look at the labor costs with a bit of skepticism. They tend to be on the low side, but as an indicator, in comparison from zone to zone, it's useful.
I'm sorry, Dan, I lost you a little bit on that transition. Can you repeat what was on the low side from the business parks?
Generally, their estimated labor costs tend to be low, and so comparing zone to zone, it's useful, but you need to provide a little bit of. It's helpful to get some other inputs on labor costs and not rely entirely on the zone.
And what kind of incentive package are available right now, at least for this particular company?
In this one, there were several grants based on hitting specific milestones. Essentially, these were rebates on the land price. So in this case, getting construction permit would trigger a grant. Completing construction would trigger a grant. Getting into production would trigger another one. there are income tax holidays both on the business, rebates on income taxes for the business and also for your more highly compensated employees. These normally run out to 5 years, and there can be a varying degree of rebate on that. Duty-free importing of equipment is pretty common. VAT rebate, or at least partial VAT rebates in the first few years of operation is pretty common. In this case, we negotiated some improvements to land, access road improvements, some preparation of land in advance of construction were negotiated. And this first time I'd seen this, but the zone also provided some living accommodation for senior managers, or 2 apartments for a period of time through the first few years of operation of the company. So it was an interesting package, a few things that had significant value for the client, particularly around the essentially amount of rebates on the land purchase triggered by certain milestones.
Okay.
Next slide. Once we had a site selected, East West provided project management to support the design and construction of the facility, to manage the overall project scope, schedule, budget, and work to select and work with both the client and the design institutes. Any project work, construction work in China, you're going to have to rely on a licensed design institute to do the design for the buildings and the infrastructure on the site. And in the case of the process industries, the process engineering as well. So we evaluated some alternative DIs and selected some we thought we could work with. And then set up a team to execute the design, the procurement, and manage construction. Worked with the client and local regulators on permitting, and as we went through the project, an emphasis brought in best practices around bidding, tendering, and selection of suppliers and payment of suppliers. And this is an area that a number of companies have had challenges in the past, and we've got experience to set up best practices along those lines. And overall, managed to execute the project quite well, brought it in, and set up good systems to manage the project as we went through it.
Oh yeah, Dan had a question come in. You're obviously the project manager on site now. What is the projected time it takes to pull this together? From beginning of once you've identified the site and you've got that contract negotiation done, how long will this take you on site to complete?
It's depends on the complexity, but for a reasonably sized project, I would be skeptical if somebody told you it would be less than 18 months. There are certain projects certain types of investments where you can go into a zone and find a building or a shell that's already available, and you can greatly accelerate it. But if you're building a greenfield site of any scale with a process, should plan on 18 months. Longer for a much larger investment, but
yeah.
Okay. So the results finally, we negotiated significant incentives in terms of rebates and grants. We expect the transportation costs and warehousing costs will see significant savings from the relocation to East China. Reducing inventories as well, as I mentioned, and overall operating costs we expect the facility to be more efficient than the one the client left behind, and so we get a modest reduction in operating costs. That's about it.
Excellent. Dan, thanks so much. That was the first presentation. Second case study is we have plant relocation closure project. And Jay, I will turn that over to you.
All right, thanks, Alex. This is a pretty classic case of a automotive parts supplier that came to China in the late 1990s. They formed a joint venture. They ultimately bought out that joint venture partner, became a woofie. They have a facility that's about 20,000 square meters, have 220 some odd employees in what's known as a standard factory. They were actually leasing the building and putting their own production equipment inside that. It was, when they first opened it, it was on the outskirts of town, if you will. But over the years, it's really been overrun by redevelopment and housing developments and so forth. So government mandated that they leave within a 10-month time frame. And they actually said that they would levy a fine of $1 million if they weren't out in time. The company really didn't have much what I would call corporate support. They basically flew in, flew out from time to time. The Chinese general manager ran the facility. So when the closure notice came, the general manager was pretty much on his own. And there really wasn't any planning associated with the closure. The general manager actually called everyone together in a town hall meeting and said the plant is going to close. We're going to keep it operating for a while, but it is going to close. Well, right as he mentioned, right after that town hall meeting, there was a major strike. That strike continued. There were some threats made to the general manager's family. They didn't have really adequate security for either the plant or personal protection for the general manager, and he resigned almost immediately. Next slide.
Yeah, and as I'm going there, one of the participants sent in another 2 questions that I will answer at the end. Dan, there about the cost and the square meters of the building. So the person who asked that, we will get to that at the end of this case study.
Okay. Next slide. So really, the company didn't have any real resources in China. They contacted EWA and they asked us to really take charge of the overall operation, the closure and the relocation. But first and foremost, obviously, we had to resolve the strike and calm tempers down and get people back to work. It wasn't what's known as a cold shutdown. In other words, close the doors, turn off all the equipment, demobilize everything, and so forth. This was going to be a hot shutdown in which we had to continually operate the facility until a new facility was available. Most importantly was that they did not want any disruption to customer shipments, which really created a challenge and obviously gave the strikers a tremendous amount of leverage in their negotiations. But that was our task, and we proceeded to mobilize a team to do that. Next slide.
Jay, quick question. Someone wrote, what's the difference between a hot and cold closure?
Well, hot closure is you continue to operate after notification of the employees and to the Labor Bureau that the plant will close at some future date. Cold closure is close the doors immediately.
You got it. All right, thank you.
So first thing we did is recruit an interim general manager to take control of not only the closure, but the relocation of the new facility. We also had a project manager that we brought in, and what they did initially was to understand what the closure environment was in that local area, what the prevailing severance compensation was, the previous labor history of any unrest, and how was that settled. Basically doing a background as to what is prevailing in that particular area, so that they weren't paying too much severance or not enough severance. They recruited Labor Bureau and PSB support. PSB support only as necessary. They didn't want them to show up unless there was a significant issue of personal injury or significant property damage. But they also got advice from the Labor Bureau on comp packages and so forth. They put together a crisis plan and then met with the strike leaders and negotiated several different types of compensation packages, all with similar I would say metrics. Some employees were going to be let go. Others were going to be asked and offered new positions in the new facility. And it was within, the new facility was within commuting distance, but the company wanted to put in a more efficient facility, so they didn't need all 225 people. So there was actually severance, and then there was an incentive to move type of program they put together. Next slide.
And Jay, there's a question of how you determine the right level of severance, and you touched on a little bit around the local prevailing comp. Can you explain on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, excuse me, plant closure has been going on for a long time. Employees know what factories have been closed and what the severance packages have been. So it's fairly easy to do a survey to say that this company paid N+1, 1 month salary for every year of service. Some companies paid 1+2, some are N+2, some paid N+2 plus an immediate sign-on bonus, which means if you sign right then and there, you get another half month's severance. So there's different ways to do it, but you need to know what sort of is the prevailing comp package for that particular area. So anyway, we were able to end the strike. We got the people back to work, all within a month. Next slide. Key issue was, and we did get support from corporate, met with the customers and guaranteed that their product deliveries would be met, and they wouldn't see any delays, and they wouldn't see any quality issues. We increased staff, the shifts, so we built inventories. We stored that inventory off-site, and that inventory was being built such that there would be it would be able to cover the downtime between demobilizing and moving the equipment to the new facility. At the same time, obviously, we added additional security. That was also IT security, as well as physical security. We had an outside guarding company come in to secure the physical assets of the facility, which I think once we had an agreement in place, I think things moved fairly quickly. Next slide. So as we continued to build the inventory, we sort of turned our attention to the new facility. So it was, again, within a busing distance, if you will, of a new facility. So we found a standard factory, 20,000 plus or minus square meters. We got that permitted. We worked with corporate to determine what equipment would go in to the new facility, what new equipment they were going to add, and basically put together basic concept plans for offices and support equipment and so forth. Next slide.
Okay, question was, how many people were at this facility? How big was this operation?
As I mentioned, it was about 200 people. The new facility, it was about 225 for the original facility, and it was going to be about 175 for the new facility.
And how many square meters was that?
And that was 20,000 square meters.
Okay.
Okay, so again, with that size, it was basically a standard building, bare building, if you will. Very few utilities in the new facility. So we had to hire a design firm, a DI. We got that on board. Then we really broke the design into really two packages. It was more of an M&E package, and then architectural finishes. So we fit out the equipment, fit out the facility, move the equipment. At the same time, there were many folks that didn't want to relocate, so we had to hire new staff. That staff needed to be trained. We trained them off-site, and at the same time, we were looking for a permanent management team to come in and basically be the plant manager and run the operation. Next slide. Once we had moved everything to the new facility, and that was up and running, we basically began to demobilize and liquidate the existing facility. We had to meet with the zone people and the government authorities, and since it was in a new district, we had to re-register and get a new business license and so forth to close out the old licenses. And it took about 9 months really to complete all that paperwork. But in essence, the new facility was up and running and supplying product to the customer. Next slide. All in all, it was a fairly successful project. I don't think there were any major issues. What was important was to get the engagement of the U.S. It wasn't one of their major operations or worldwide, so I can't say they gave a lot of attention to it. But once we started putting together the plan and requiring decisions to be made, they did step up and put the right people in place to support us, so we could do our job to get this thing relocated and up and running and give product and get product to their customers. So all in all, a pretty good product.
Jay, two questions came in. One was, who should make that a plan announcement? Where do they make it? And then the second was around theft of IP and physical assets, and how the different way you go out to protect physical assets versus intellectual property.
Well, first of all, the announcement. The announcements really, one has to do their homework first and understand, honestly evaluate their labor relations and understand their labor history. If it's a situation where they've had militancy in the past, they've had troublemakers, um, uh, and there's the likelihood that there's going to be significant pushback or disruption, then you definitely want to move and have an announcement made off-site. If you have it off-site and the employees become unruly, if you're in a public place like a three-star hotel or even a development zone administration building, auditorium, whatever, the PSB will respond to that. In many cases, they won't respond if you do it in your own plant, unless the threshold of physical violence has already been breached. Who should give it should be someone well respected by the company. In most cases, it's generally a senior local person that it could be supported by someone from the States or from the region, but it should be in Mandarin. It shouldn't be an expat that has to, and then a translator that really doesn't work well. And there needs to be full transparency. You can't say, well, we're thinking about the compensation package. We'll get back to you on that. That doesn't work. You need to be very clear when you mention that it's going to be closed. You're going to say, here is the severance package. We're offering a generous package of this. If you sign today or this week, we're going to give you another half month or whatever. So what you don't want to do is create a lot of uncertainty. If there's uncertainty, then people are going to strike and they're going to be disruptive. That's what I would certainly recommend a senior local person if possible. Theft of IP, obviously physical assets, you need to, in many cases, augment your physical security staff with an outside firm and make sure that they're properly briefed on who, what, when, and where, and how. And they need to be experienced people so they can diffuse any unrest. As far as IP theft, that's really an IT issue that has to be thought through as to who is going to have access, and then monitor that access to see if there's any people on the trying to download through the servers, the local servers or whatever, intellectual property, and be aware of that, and then take the appropriate action after that.
Excellent. All right, and we also had a question. Two questions came in, Dan, regarding the facility. First question was, how big in square meters was the plant?
The site's 25,000 square meters. The built up space is about 15,000 square meters under roof.
Right, and then we talked about the cost of the question was around the cost of the construction, excluding equipment. Obviously, that was the question there around the cost of the construction, excluding equipment for this type of projects. And we've done very large ones and mid-sized ones as smaller ones. But for this one, the potential cost of construction for this.
For just the buildings and infrastructure, it'll be on the order of $10 million. And on top of that will be process equipment, utilities equipment. But buildings and infrastructure will be about $10 million.
Okay.
I might add to that, Alex. If they're looking for a square foot number if for an enclosed factory without production equipment. From a planning and budgeting standpoint, I would figure on probably somewhere between $80 and $90 per square foot.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
convert that to square meters and renminbi.
yeah, yeah.
That doesn't include the production equipment.
Good average. All right. Well, we started at 9:30 at 9:30 Eastern. Want to finish at 10:30. So for Chinatown, we're here within an hour. So we wanted to stop and make sure. Thank you all very much for coming. Want to get within an hour. Keep it within an hour. Thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate. If you have any questions, you've got our information here. Please email me. Please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. We are putting articles up there pretty much every week. We are putting them up 2 or 3 times a week, as well as articles. Our team has written on products, not only on this one, but on future topics we'll be talking about. The next webinar will be on supply chain and the effect of the tariffs and the environmental compliance. So please feel free to follow us. Thank you very much for attending. We appreciate your time. Bye-bye.